Over 13,000 homes vanished in just 4 days. 87 churches turned to ash. Nearly every landmark in London completely wiped off the map. But here's the number that'll really mess with your head. Only 6 confirmed deaths. Just 6 from the most devastating fire in England's history. How in God's name does an inferno swallow an entire city, yet barely touch its people? That's the question that haunted me while digging into this story. And let me tell you, the answers will blow your mind. It's not just about who made it out alive, but how they survived. The split-second decisions, the bizarre things they saved instead of their neighbors, the desperate and often downright crazy attempts to stop the flames. So yeah, if these tales help you sleep at night, a like or subscribe would be awesome. Drop a comment about where and when you're listening too. I check them all, and it's wild seeing folks from Australia to Norway tuning in. Tonight's story? The Great Fire of London. But first, are you comfy? Seriously, check. Pillows, blankets, get cozy. This one's worth settling in for. Alright, picture this. You're waking up in London, September 1666. First thing hitting you isn't smoke. Not yet. It's the medieval city's everyday stench, raw sewage, rotting food, and the pungent tang of bodies that haven't seen soap in months, all stewing in summer heat. Unlike your crisp sheets tonight, your bed's just a lumpy straw mattress on creaky wood, maybe with a scratchy wool blanket if you're lucky. London's houses stood packed like matches in a box, and not just side by side. They bulged outward with each floor, upper stories jutting over the streets below until buildings nearly kissed at the rooftops. They called this jettying, a medieval real estate hack for squeezing out extra square footage. Those charming half-timbered cottages from fairy tales? That was most of London. Wooden skeletons stuffed with wattle and daub, translation, twigs woven together and packed with mud mixed with horsehair, dung, and straw. Basically kindling waiting to happen, especially after the driest summer anyone could remember baked everything to perfection. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's set the stage properly. It's Saturday night, September 1st, 1666. King Charles II been on the throne 6 years. The Great Plague that wiped out a fifth of London just ended. People are finally breathing easy again. Down on Pudding Lane near London Bridge, Baker Thomas Farriner's closing shop. Side note, pudding had nothing to do with dessert. It came from puddings, meaning animal guts from the nearby meat market that would wash down the street. Charming, right? This was London, a cramped, stinking hive of 350,000 souls living atop each other inside medieval walls, their wooden fire traps just waiting for a spark. Master Farriner, should I bank the ovens? His apprentice calls. Already handled. Thomas replies, dusting flour from his hands. Fire's out. Get some rest. Farriner wasn't some amateur. He was the king's own baker, supplying the Royal Navy. The man knew ovens. Or so he'd later swear in court. After what he claimed was a final oven check, Farriner headed upstairs with his family, daughter Hannah, his son, and a maid whose name history couldn't be bothered to record. They all turned in, unaware that below them, something still glowed. Maybe an escaped ember. Maybe a spark on kindling. We'll never know. What we do know, around 1 a.m., the baker's house became an oven itself. The Farriners woke to hell. Flames had swallowed the ground floor, blocking the stairs. Their only escape? An upstairs window. Thomas, his son and daughter scrambled onto a neighbor's roof. But the maid? Frozen by fear of heights, she stayed, becoming the fire's first victim. Imagine that impossible choice. Flames licking at your heels versus a terrifying drop. While you're snug in bed tonight, think, what would you choose? By 2 a.m., the baker's house was fully engulfed, flames licking at the star inn next door. The inn stables, packed with hay, went up like tinder. From there, fire leapt to Thames Street's warehouses. And here's where bad became catastrophic. These warehouses held oil, tallow, and other flammables. When the fire hit them, they didn't just burn, they exploded. Eyewitnesses swore materials combusted before flames even touched them, ignited by radiant heat alone. Fire! Fire! The cries echoed through narrow streets as church bells rang alarms, starting with Street Magnus the Martyr near Pudding Lane. People spilled into streets in nightshirts, bleary-eyed at first, then panicked as the sky glowed orange. Just another fire, some muttered dismissively. London had small fires constantly. Every neighborhood kept leather buckets and hooks to pull down burning buildings. But this was different. This fire was alive, hungry. By 3 a.m., 300 houses were gone, and the fire grew exponentially. Samuel Pepys, a Navy office clerk, got woken by his maid. He peeked out, figured it was far off, and went back to bed. Meanwhile, someone smarter alerted Lord Mayor Sir Thomas Bloodworth. As city leader, he could order demolitions to create fire breaks, the era's main firefighting tactic. When Bloodworth reached Pudding Lane, people begged for demolitions. He hesitated. Pish. He reportedly scoffed at the flames. A woman might piss it out. Famous last words. The fire he dismissed would soon eat his city alive. To be fair, demolitions were a big deal. Most Londoners rented, and destroying property meant lawsuits. Plus, it was the dead of night. Property owners weren't around to consent. So Bloodworth went back to bed, promising to return at dawn. By then, it would be too late. As Sunday dawned, something terrifying happened. The fire created its own weather. The heat grew so intense it generated powerful updrafts, sucking in air from all directions, what we'd now call a firestorm. Worse, a strong east wind kicked up, driving flames westward into London's heart. Over on Seething Lane, Pepys woke again at 7 a.m. This time, he dressed hurriedly and went out. What he saw shocked him. The fire had mushroomed overnight. Taking a Thames boat for a better view, he saw the waterfront ablaze. The warehouses were all one flame, he wrote in his famous diary, watching people desperately save belongings. Good Lord, what a sight. Let me paint you that scene. The Thames jammed with every boat imaginable, from tiny rowboats to barges. People hurled furniture, clothes, trade goods, heirlooms, some straight into the river, figuring waterlogged was better than burned. On shore, pure chaos. People sprinting with armloads, horses and carts stuck in panicked crowds, shopkeepers rescuing inventory. Pepys, alarmed, went straight to Whitehall Palace. King Charles and his brother James, Duke of York, knew about the fire but not at scale. After Pepys' report, Charles put James in charge of firefighting while he helped coordinate. Back in the city, things worsened. The fire became a roaring beast, devouring everything. The heat was so intense that it could be felt from hundreds of yards away. The noise was terrifying, a constant roar punctuated by the crash of collapsing buildings and occasional explosions as barrels of oil or gunpowder ignited. And then came the rumors, spreading faster than the flames themselves. This was no accident, people whispered. The French did it. The Dutch. Maybe even Catholics. Someone had set London ablaze on purpose. When disaster strikes, humans need someone to blame. And England in 1666 had enemies to spare, at war with both France and the Netherlands, simmering with anti-Catholic sentiment. Fear curdled into deadly suspicion faster than milk in July heat. I saw a mob set upon a Frenchman, one witness later recounted. They'd convinced themselves he carried fireballs to spread the flames. The poor bastard nearly got beaten to death before soldiers intervened. This was the ugly underbelly of catastrophe, the way terror twists into violence, how easily they becomes the target when why has no easy answers. As Sunday night fell, London looked downright apocalyptic. A third of the city now burned, the flames forming a wall half a mile wide. The sky glowed an unnatural red-orange, visible for miles. Burning debris rained down like hell's own snowfall. And still the fire grew, relentless. In wealthy Lombard Street, far from where this all started, banker Robert Viner did some quick math. Not with money this time, but minutes. How long until the flames reached his mansion? What could he save? What would he lose? Unlike Pudding Lane's poor souls, Viner had options. He hired every available cart and porter to move his gold, jewels, documents, anything valuable. Sent his family ahead while he stayed to supervise the evacuation of his fortune. Take it to Windsor Castle. He ordered his most trusted servants, leveraging royal connections to safeguard his treasures. Picture this. standing in your burning city, forced to choose between family photos and financial records, heirlooms, or the deed to your house. What would you grab with minutes before everything turned to ash? For the wealthy like Viner, this meant inconvenience and financial hits. For London's poor, total ruin, no country estates to flee to, no powerful friends offering shelter. By midnight Sunday, over 1,000 buildings were gone. The city gates jammed with fleeing crowds carrying whatever they could. Fields north of London filled with refugees huddled around salvaged scraps of their lives. And the fire? That hungry, remorseless beast showed no signs of stopping. Sunday was ending, but London's nightmare was just beginning. Now about those riverside warehouses, let me tell you what was really inside, because it's insane. One held whale oil. Another stored tallow, animal fat for candles. Then there was pitch, tar, hemp, timber, like someone gathered the world's most flammable materials and said store them together. What could go wrong? When these went up, they didn't just burn. They created furnace-like heat capable of melting iron. One witness saw the iron chains on London Bridge glow red-hot before snapping. Try imagining that heat, the kind that makes stone explode and metal run like liquid, that creates its own wind system, feeding itself, growing stronger with every bite. As the first day ended, Londoners faced a terrible truth. This was no ordinary fire. This was biblical, unprecedented, unstoppable, and the worst? Still coming. Dawn broke Monday, day 2. Anyone hoping the flames might have died down overnight got a rude awakening. The fire hadn't weakened. It had grown stronger, angrier. If you'd slept at all, you'd wake to a transformed city. The sky wasn't blue anymore, just churning black smoke and orange glow blocking the sun. Every breath scratched your lungs. Eyes watered constantly. And the noise, Christ, the noise, the endless roar of flames, crashing buildings, desperate shouts. Picture a firewall 30 feet high in places, moving through streets like a living thing. Heat so intense buildings combusted before flames touched them. Windows shattered from thermal stress. Paint bubbled off walls. Then when the main fire hit, centuries-old structures vanished in minutes. It's moving faster than a man can walk, one witness reported. Let that sink in, a fire outpacing human speed. By Monday morning, flames reached London's financial heart, the Royal Exchange. Inside this grand trading center, merchants from across Europe conducted business that made London wealthy. Now, save what you can. The cry went up as traders scrambled for goods. The exchange held silks from China, spices from India, American gold, all about to become fuel. Merchant Nicholas Barbin watched helplessly. 10 years of trade gone in an instant. He clutched a ledger like a life raft. God help us all. But neither God nor man seemed capable of stopping this. By mid-morning, the Royal Exchange was fully engulfed. Its stone columns, which everyone assumed would withstand fire, glowed red before cracking apart. The noise, the thunder of impetuous flames, wrote diarist John Evelyn. The shrieking of women and children, the fall of towers, houses, and churches was like a hideous storm. To grasp the economic impact, imagine Wall Street, the NYSE, and the Federal Reserve all burning simultaneously. That's what happened to London's economy that Monday morning. By noon, panic set in hard. Though easterly winds still pushed flames west, the fire now spread in all directions. People who'd stayed to protect property abandoned hope, grabbing what they could and joining the exodus. Streets became pure chaos, carts piled high with household goods, furniture, merchandise. Rich merchants paid teams to move stock. The poor carried bundles on their backs. Transportation prices became extortionate. What cost a shilling normally now demanded £2, over a month's wages for workers. £5 to take your trunk to Moorfields, a carter shouted at a desperate family. That's robbery, the father protested. The carter just shrugged. Find someone else then. Supply and demand at its most brutal. Many couldn't pay, forced to abandon everything. Meanwhile, shoemaker Sybil Tame grew increasingly nervous at Christ's Hospital School. The fire remained distant, but smoke darkened the sky. The fire's rumble sounded like approaching thunder. They say it'll never reach us, her eldest daughter said hopefully. Sybil wasn't convinced. Your father always said hope for the best, prepare for the worst. Start packing our tools. She was right to worry. This fire broke all rules, defied expectations. By afternoon, King Charles II and his brother James took personal command, not just for show. Charles actually joined bucket brigades, passing water hand to hand, his fine clothes smeared with soot, hands blistered. Unprecedented, the king working alongside bakers and blacksmiths. He also authorized large-scale demolitions for firebreaks, politically risky moves only royalty could order. But even these drastic measures often failed. The fire jumped breaks, ignited buildings supposedly out of reach through ember attacks, a terrifying phenomenon most didn't understand then. Intense heat created updrafts carrying burning debris hundreds of yards, starting new fires ahead of the main blaze. Firefighters would contain one area only to find 3 new outbreaks behind them, like fighting a hydra. By late afternoon, Charles ordered troops to assist. His own lifeguards helped civilians and maintained order as fear bred violence. It's the Dutch, someone would shout, pointing at foreigners. Catholics did this. Mobs attacked innocents. A French watchmaker nearly beaten to death. A Portuguese merchant's house looted on false claims. Sound familiar? We still do this. When things go bad, we hunt for scapegoats. Something to ponder as you lie safe in bed, protected from both flames and mob justice. As evening approached Monday, the fire reached Cheapside, London's main market street lined with luxury shops. All became fuel. Bookseller Joshua Curtin, whose shop stood near St. Paul's, grew increasingly alarmed. After seeing the Royal Exchange's fate, he wasn't taking chances. Everything valuable into the cathedral, he ordered apprentices. Stone walls will protect our stock. Others had the same idea. St. Paul's crypt rapidly filled with books, furniture, clothes, merchant goods. There's no safer place in London, Joshua assured a fellow bookseller as they crammed inventory into the crowded space. Even if the whole city burns, St. Paul's will stand. If only he knew how wrong he was. As Monday night deepened, the fire formed a crescent of destruction nearly a mile wide. The glow was so bright people could reportedly read by it at midnight from Windsor, 20 miles away. For those still in the city, sleep was impossible, not just from light and noise, but constant fear the fire might change direction and trap them. Every wind shift caused fresh panic. Many gave up on rest, moving possessions through the night, while streets remained lit by hellish glow. Banker Robert Viner had successfully evacuated his valuables to Windsor, but remained in London, staying ahead of flames, trying to salvage investments. The exchange is gone, his steward reported. And my offices? Viner asked, already knowing the answer. Nothing remains, sir. Not one brick standing. Viner had lost millions in modern terms, but unlike London's poor, he had country properties, court connections. He'd survive financially. Many wouldn't. Walking through London that night revealed stark divides. The wealthy hired protection, had options. The poor sat on bundles in fields, watching homes burn with no idea what came next. Where will we go? A woman asked her husband as they huddled with children in Moorfields. I don't know, he admitted. But we're alive. We'll figure something out. That sentiment. We're alive, we'll figure it out. Captures human resilience. Something to remember facing your own disasters. Hopefully less catastrophic. As Monday became Tuesday, day 3, the wind showed no mercy. If anything, it strengthened, driving flames west with frightening speed. The fire had consumed most of the walled city, but now pushed beyond, threatening Westminster and government seats. King Charles, back at Whitehall for brief rest, got urgent news. The fire approached the Temple, legal district housing irreplaceable records. If it fell, England's legal system could collapse. Land titles, precedents, laws lost forever. Charles immediately ordered more demolitions around the Temple. No consulting owners now. He also worried about the Tower of London's armory and gunpowder stores in the fire's potential path. Send word to the Tower, he commanded. Move gunpowder to river ships immediately. Meanwhile, ordinary Londoners kept fighting, Bucket chains formed where water existed. Men with hooks pulled down buildings to create gaps. But water grew scarce. Pipes had melted or been destroyed. Thames water reached fire lines through exhausting bucket chains hundreds long. Those primitive fire engines? Useless. Their weak streams evaporated before reaching flames, needing constant refills. Some tried desperate measures: milk, beer, even urine when water ran out. I saw a man use blood from a butcher shop to douse his doorway, one witness said. The fire took his house anyway. Nothing worked. Nothing stopped this relentless beast devouring London street by street. By midnight Monday, the fire had burned nearly 48 hours straight, showing no weakness. If anything, it grew stronger, feeding on countless wooden structures. Our 3 Londoners, Sybil, Joshua, Robert, remained ahead of flames. But for how long? The fire moved unpredictably, confounding containment attempts. As Monday ended and Tuesday began, London faced a terrifying possibility. This fire might not stop until it consumed everything. The worst was still coming. Tuesday morning, day 3, dawned with London transformed into a living vision of hell. Thick black smoke blotted out the sun completely now. The air hung heavy with ash and embers, each breath scraping against raw lungs. The heat, Christ, the heat, radiated from every surface, the ground, the walls, the very air itself. For those who'd spent the night in fields outside the city, dawn brought no relief, just the grim confirmation that the fire had continued its relentless march overnight. The London they knew was disappearing hour by hour, street by merciless street. From Moorfields, the largest refugee camp, the view was both mesmerizing and horrifying. One survivor described it as a sea of fire, with flames leaping hundreds of feet as they consumed taller buildings. Will it ever stop? A child asked her mother as they watched the distant inferno. The question hung unanswered in the smoky air, because the brutal truth was nobody knew. This fire defied all expectations, all previous experience. By Tuesday, desperation had birthed radical measures. Conventional firefighting was abandoned entirely. King Charles authorized using gunpowder to blow up buildings, creating massive fire breaks through controlled destruction. This wasn't the small-scale demolitions of previous days. This was military-grade demolition, barrels of gunpowder placed inside doomed buildings by soldiers and sailors who literally raced against the approaching flames. "Clear the street," a soldier shouted before detonating a row of houses on Cripplegate. The explosion that followed shook the ground like an earthquake, sending debris flying in all directions. Where 3 houses once stood, now only a smoking crater remained. Yet even these extreme measures often failed. The fire simply leaped across newly created gaps, igniting buildings through sheer heat or wind-borne embers. The blaze now stretched nearly 1.5 miles wide, consuming everything in its westward path toward Westminster and Whitehall Palace. Our bookseller Joshua Curtin had spent Monday night inside St. Paul's Cathedral with dozens of other merchants guarding their salvaged goods in the crypt. The massive stone church seemed like the one safe haven left in London. Outside, the churchyard had become a chaotic storage yard, piled high with furniture, trade goods, household items. They say the fires reached Ludgate Hill. Another bookseller told Joshua as they stood in the cathedral's doorway. Ludgate Hill was the main approach to St. Paul's from the east, and the direction from which the fire came. "How long do we have?" Joshua asked. The man just shrugged. "Hours maybe. Not long." Joshua looked back at the cathedral's cavernous interior, now crammed with people's entire livelihoods. His life's work, thousands of books, manuscripts, prints, lay in the crypt below. If St. Paul's fell, but no, that was unthinkable. The cathedral had stood for centuries, its walls 5 feet thick in places. If anything could withstand the fire, surely it would be St. Paul's. Meanwhile, in northern London, our shoemaker Sybil Tame frantically packed her tools. Christ Hospital stood just outside the fire's current path, but she wasn't taking chances. "Take only what we need to start again," she told her daughters as they sorted through belongings. Easier said than done. Each specialized tool represented an investment, some passed down from her late husband. In the end, they took what they could carry: essential tools, some leather, clothes, a few keepsakes. "Where will we go?" her youngest asked. "West," Sybil decided. "Away from the fire. We'll find somewhere." This was the reality for thousands, leaving with no clear destination, just the desperate need to escape the flames. The exodus reached biblical proportions now. Every road out of London jammed with people on foot, horseback, carts. Samuel Pepys described it in his diary. "The streets and highways are full of people, all flying from one place to another." But not everyone fled. Some stayed to fight, out of duty, stubbornness, or desperation. Others saw opportunity in chaos. Looters moved through abandoned buildings like rats. "I saw a man running with silver plate," one witness reported, "laughing like a madman." The crisis revealed both the best and worst of humanity, acts of extraordinary courage alongside shameless exploitation. Some risked their lives to save strangers. Others charged exorbitant prices for basic transportation. The same disaster, two completely different responses. By midday Tuesday, the fire reached Ludgate, the western city gate, and climbed Ludgate Hill towards St. Paul's. The grand old cathedral now stood directly in harm's way. Outside, pandemonium erupted as people who'd stored goods inside now tried to remove them, while others still arrived with more possessions, creating dangerous bottlenecks at the doors. "Stand back," shouted a member of the Duke of York's firefighting team. The building must be cleared, but it was too late for orderly evacuation. Flames already licked at the cathedral's scaffolding, erected for repairs, and from there spread to the roof. Then something unimaginable happened. The cathedral's limestone walls, which everyone assumed were fireproof, began cracking and exploding from the intense heat. Chunks of stone shot outward like cannonballs, striking buildings and people below. John Evelyn witnessed it. The stones of St. Paul's flew like grenades, the melting lead running down the streets in a stream, and the very pavements glowing with fiery redness, so as no horse nor man was able to tread on them. Imagine that. Streets so hot they burned horses' hooves, molten lead flowing like water from the roof. Inside, Joshua watched in horror as smoke filtered through the ceiling. The temperature spiked rapidly. "The roof's on fire," someone screamed, triggering a stampede for the exits. Joshua tried reaching the crypt, but got swept outside by the panicked crowd. Turning back, he saw the great wooden roof timbers collapse in a shower of sparks, molten lead pouring down the cathedral's sides like silver waterfalls. In that moment, he knew everything was gone. His entire inventory, his livelihood, years of work, all ashes. And he wasn't alone. Hundreds of merchants had stored goods in St. Paul's, believing it safe. Now they all watched their livelihoods vanish in smoke. The fall of St. Paul's marked a psychological turning point. If the mighty cathedral couldn't withstand the flames, what hope was there? Yet even as it burned, efforts continued elsewhere. The gunpowder demolitions were creating wider firebreaks. King Charles and the Duke of York remained personally involved, directing operations, encouraging exhausted firefighters. But the fire seemed almost sentient, finding ways around obstacles, exploiting weaknesses like a cunning enemy. One major concern was the Tower of London to the east. Not just a historic fortress, but an arsenal containing enough gunpowder to level much of what remained if ignited. And now, ominously, the wind began shifting. "If the fire reaches the tower, God help us all," muttered a guard overseeing gunpowder evacuation to river barges. By late afternoon, the tower's situation became critical. Flames approached from multiple directions. Soldiers and citizens formed desperate bucket chains from the Thames, trying to wet down surrounding buildings. As a last resort, the tower's commander ordered nearby houses blown up with gunpowder, creating a firebreak just in time. The flames came within yards of the tower's outer walls before being stopped. It was one of few victories in what had otherwise been a relentless retreat before the fire's advance. As Tuesday evening approached, banker Robert Viner watched from his country house in Hampstead, safely distant from the chaos. The view was apocalyptic. Central London appeared entirely engulfed, the sky glowing unnatural hues, smoke columns bending westward. "They say St. Paul's has fallen," another banker remarked. Viner nodded grimly. "I saw it go up. The roof collapsed around 3. The question hung between them. What would remain when this ended? For wealthy men like Viner, this meant financial loss and inconvenience. For the poor in refugee camps, total devastation. Moorfields, Finsbury Fields. These open spaces had become vast tent cities of improvised shelters. Conditions deteriorated rapidly, food scarce, clean water rare, sanitation non-existent. Disease spread through overcrowded camps. "My children haven't eaten since yesterday," one woman told Sybil, who shared her meager bread. The king had ordered emergency food supplies, but distribution was chaotic. Those with money paid exorbitant prices. Many went without. As night fell Tuesday, day 3, the fire continued burning fiercely, though its advance became less predictable as winds shifted. The western city, including Fleet Street and the Temple, was now fully ablaze. Some hoped the Fleet River might stop the flames, but this narrow, polluted tributary of the Thames proved no match. Would the fire cross? If it did, Westminster and Whitehall Palace lay directly in its path. King Charles received constant updates at Whitehall. The situation remained precarious, but faint signs of hope emerged. The wind dropped slightly. Some firebreaks held. No one dared declare victory yet. The fire had defied all expectations thus far. Only when people saw containment with their own eyes would they believe. And so Tuesday night deepened. London still a city in crisis. The fire had burned nearly 72 hours without pause, destroying most of the walled city and threatening beyond. Thousands were homeless, hungry, terrified. Yet even amid catastrophe, moments of remarkable humanity shone. Strangers sharing food, homes opening to those who'd lost everything, neighbors helping neighbors. "We shall rebuild," the king had declared earlier. "London will rise from these ashes." Easy for him to say. He had palaces. The average Londoner had lost everything. Yet his words held truth. Cities are more than buildings. They're communities of people. And while stone and wood may burn, the human spirit proves remarkably resilient. As you lie in your comfortable bed tonight, safe and secure, try imagining what it would mean to lose everything in a single day. Your home, possessions, livelihood. Where would you go? What would you do? These were the questions facing tens of thousands as the Great Fire entered its 4th day, with no insurance, no safety net, just their own resourcefulness and others' kindness. What strikes me isn't their suffering, though immense, but their resilience, facing unimaginable catastrophe and finding ways to keep going. A firefighter once told me, "In disaster, look for the helpers." And helpers were everywhere, even in London's darkest hour. But would it be enough? As Tuesday turned to Wednesday, that question remained. The fire still burned. Danger still loomed. London's fate still hung in the balance. "The whole city is but one smoldering ruin," one witness wrote that night. Hard to argue. From certain vantage points, all London seemed aflame. Yet people kept fighting, bucket by bucket, building by building, street by street, refusing to surrender their city without a battle. And as the wind finally began dropping, ever so slightly, came the first fragile hope that the tide might turn, that the seemingly unstoppable Great Fire might finally have met its match in Londoners' determination. The question was, had that determination come in time to save what remained? Wednesday morning, September 5th, day 4 of the Inferno. The smoke had thickened to a choking blanket, turning the sun into a dim red disk when visible at all. From the refugee camps in surrounding fields, displaced Londoners watched their city's continued destruction through stinging eyes. The fire had raged for over 72 relentless hours, consuming homes, businesses, churches, everything in its path. Yet something had shifted overnight. The east wind that had driven the flames westward for 3 days finally slackened. And in some areas, the massive fire breaks created by gunpowder demolitions were actually working. For the first time since this nightmare began, cautious hope flickered. Maybe, just maybe, the tide was turning. King Charles, having snatched a few hours of sleep at Whitehall Palace, returned to the streets at dawn. His brother the Duke of York reported, "The wind's dropping. If it holds, we might contain this yet." But even as hope grew, destruction continued. Fleet Street, the Inns of Court, parts of the Temple area, all burned fiercely. New dangers emerged from the aftermath. Partially burned buildings teetered on collapse, their structural integrity compromised. The ground remained furnace-hot in places, impossible to walk on without scorching footwear. "Watch the walls," came a sudden shout as a group salvaging goods from a damaged Fleet Street building scattered seconds before its facade collapsed outward. Not everyone reacted in time. Reports came in all day of injuries and deaths from falling debris. The king had issued proclamations warning people to avoid burned areas, but desperation overrode caution. People needed to see if anything could be salvaged from their homes and businesses. For our bookseller Joshua Curtin, there was nothing left. St. Paul's Cathedral, where he'd stored his entire inventory, was now just a smoldering skeleton. "All gone," he muttered in the churchyard, staring at the ruins. Every last page. This wasn't just about losing current stock. His entire business model had evaporated. No capital to restart, no shop, no means of support. Like thousands of others, he'd been reduced to destitution in days. Meanwhile, in northern London, shoemaker Sybil Tame tried keeping her daughter's spirits up despite their grim circumstances in Moorfield's camp. "At least we have our tools," she reminded them under their makeshift shelter. "With these, we can start again." This sentiment echoed throughout the refugee camps. The determination to rebuild, to not be defined by disaster. But for many, the path forward remained unclear. The fire had destroyed not just homes, but entire industries. Printing, cloth-making, spice trading, all centered in now-ruined districts. Thousands of apprentices and journeymen faced their skills becoming worthless overnight if their masters couldn't restart businesses. By midday Wednesday, the fire had reached Ludgate and was climbing towards St. Paul's, directly threatening the grand old church that had dominated London's skyline for centuries. Outside the cathedral, chaos reigned as people who'd stored goods inside now tried removing them, while others still arrived with more possessions. "Stand back," shouted a firefighter. "The building must be cleared." But orderly evacuation proved impossible. Flames already licked at the repair scaffolding, spreading rapidly to the roof. Then came the unimaginable. The cathedral's limestone walls, assumed fireproof, began cracking and exploding from intense heat. John Evelyn witnessed stones of St. Paul's flying like grenades, while molten lead from the roof ran down streets in streams, creating pavement so hot no horse nor man could tread on it. Inside, Joshua watched smoke filter through the ceiling as temperatures spiked. "The roof's on fire," triggered a stampede. He tried reaching the crypt but got swept outside by the panicked crowd. Turning back, he saw the great wooden roof timbers collapse in a fiery shower, molten lead cascading down the cathedral's sides. In that moment, he knew everything was gone. His life's work, his livelihood, all ashes. And he wasn't alone. Hundreds of merchants storing goods in St. Paul's faced the same devastating loss. The cathedral's fall marked a psychological turning point. If this mighty structure couldn't withstand the flames, what could? Yet even as it burned, efforts continued elsewhere. The gunpowder demolitions were creating wider fire breaks. King Charles and the Duke of York remained hands-on, directing operations, encouraging exhausted firefighters. But the fire seemed almost sentient, finding ways around obstacles, exploiting weaknesses like a cunning enemy. One major concern was the Tower of London to the east, not just historic, but housing an arsenal that could level much of what remained if ignited. And now, ominously, the wind began shifting. "If fire reaches the tower, God help us all," muttered a guard overseeing gunpowder evacuation to river barges. By late afternoon, the situation became critical. Flames approached from multiple directions. Soldiers and citizens formed desperate bucket chains from the Thames, dousing surrounding buildings. As a last resort, the tower's commander ordered nearby houses blown up, creating a firebreak just in time. The flames came within yards before being stopped, one of few victories in this relentless retreat. As evening approached, banker Robert Viner watched from his country house in Hampstead, safely distant from the chaos. The view was apocalyptic. Central London appeared entirely engulfed, the sky glowing unnatural hues, smoke columns bending westward. "They say St. Paul's has fallen," another banker remarked. Viner nodded grimly. "I saw it go up. The roof collapsed around 3. The question hung between them. What would remain when this ended? For wealthy men like Viner, this meant financial loss and inconvenience. For the poor in refugee camps, total devastation. Moorfields, Finsbury Fields. These open spaces had become vast tent cities of improvised shelters. Conditions deteriorated rapidly. Food scarce, clean water rare, sanitation non-existent. Disease spread through overcrowded camps. "My children haven't eaten since yesterday," one woman told Sybil, who shared her meager bread. The king had ordered emergency food supplies, but distribution was chaotic. Those with money paid exorbitant prices. Many went without. As night fell Wednesday, day 4, the fire continued burning fiercely, though its advance became less predictable as winds shifted. The western city, including Fleet Street and the Temple, was now fully ablaze. Some hoped the Fleet River might stop the flames, but this narrow, polluted tributary of the Thames proved no match. Would the fire cross? If it did, Westminster and Whitehall Palace lay directly in its path. King Charles received constant updates at Whitehall. The situation remained precarious, but faint signs of hope emerged. The wind dropped slightly. Some firebreaks held. No one dared declare victory yet. The fire had defied all expectations thus far. Only when people saw containment with their own eyes would they believe. And so Wednesday night deepened. London still a city in crisis. The fire had burned nearly 96 hours without pause, destroying most of the walled city and threatening beyond. Thousands were homeless, hungry, terrified. Yet even amid catastrophe, moments of remarkable humanity shone. Strangers sharing food, homes opening to those who'd lost everything, neighbors helping neighbors. "We shall rebuild," the king had declared earlier. "London will rise from these ashes." Easy for him to say. He had palaces. The average Londoner had lost everything. Yet his words held truth. Cities are more than buildings. They're communities of people. And while stone and wood may burn, the human spirit proves remarkably resilient. As you lie in your comfortable bed tonight, safe and secure, try imagining what it would mean to lose everything in a single day. Your home, possessions, livelihood. Where would you go? What would you do? These were the questions facing tens of thousands as the Great Fire entered its 5th day, with no insurance, no safety net, just their own resourcefulness and others' kindness. What strikes me isn't their suffering, though immense, but their resilience, facing unimaginable catastrophe and finding ways to keep going. A firefighter once told me, "In disaster, look for the helpers." And helpers were everywhere, even in London's darkest hour. But would it be enough? As Wednesday turned to Thursday, that question remained. The fire still burned. Danger still loomed. London's fate still hung in the balance. "The whole city is but one smoldering ruin," one witness wrote that night. Hard to argue. From certain vantage points, all London seemed aflame. Yet people kept fighting, bucket by bucket, building by building, street by street, refusing to surrender their city without a battle. And as the wind finally began dropping, ever so slightly, came the first fragile hope that the tide might turn, that the seemingly unstoppable Great Fire might finally have met its match in Londoners' determination. The question was, had that determination come in time to save what remained? Thursday morning, September 6th, the 5th day since the fire began. A different quality of light filtered through the thinning smoke, still acrid and choking, but no longer the impenetrable black shroud of previous days. For the thousands camped in fields surrounding the city, these small changes carried disproportionate hope. The winds had dropped completely overnight, a runner reported to the exhausted refugees in Moorfields. They say the fire's contained in most areas now. The news spread through the makeshift camp like flame through dry grass, whispered from family to family, carrying cautious relief to people who'd spent 4 days wondering if anything would survive. In your comfortable bed tonight, with your soft pillows and climate control, take a moment to appreciate what these refugees endured. Most had slept on bare earth for days. Many owned nothing but the clothes they wore and whatever they'd carried out. Food was rationed, water sources contaminated, sanitation non-existent. And over everything hung the constant fear that the fire might yet spread to these very fields where they'd sought refuge. So when word came that the flames were finally being contained, that the devouring beast might at last be restrained, it felt like that first gasp of air after nearly drowning. Within the city walls, the situation showed tentative signs of stabilization. The massive fire breaks created by gunpowder demolitions were finally proving effective, halting the westward march toward Westminster and Whitehall Palace. The Duke of York, who hadn't slept properly since Sunday, surveyed the scene from the western edge of the burned district. "We've contained it here," he told his soot-streaked team. "But stay vigilant for flare-ups. The ground's still hot enough to reignite kindling." Indeed, the danger wasn't completely past. Though the main fire fronts had been stopped, smaller fires still burned throughout the devastated areas. Buildings that had smoldered for days could suddenly burst back into flames. The intense heat retained by stone and brick structures meant spontaneous combustion remained a real threat. But the worst was over. The Great Fire, which had seemed an unstoppable force of nature for 4 terrifying days, had finally met its match in human determination and changing weather patterns. By midday Thursday, King Charles felt confident enough to issue a proclamation, not just about the fire's containment, but addressing the ugly rumors that had spread as quickly as the flames. "Let it be known," the declaration read, "that after thorough investigation, the fire began accidentally in a baker's house on Pudding Lane. Any claims of foreign plots or malicious intent are false and must cease." The king understood what every leader learns during crises: disasters breed scapegoating. Already, there'd been attacks on French and Dutch residents, Catholic families driven from camps by hostile neighbors. The proclamation aimed to stem this tide of misplaced vengeance. Yet despite royal decrees, suspicion ran deep. "They say a Frenchman confessed to starting it," insisted one man in the Moorfields camp, ignoring the official statement. "I heard it was papists, part of some plot against the crown," countered another. This need to assign blame, to transform random tragedy into intentional malice, is a human reflex we still see today. When the world burns inexplicably, we'd rather believe in villains than accept cruel chance. Meanwhile, back in the city's charred heart, the first tentative steps toward recovery began. Our shoemaker Sybil Tame was among the first to venture into the still smoldering ruins. Christ's Hospital, where she'd lived and worked, stood just on the fire's edge. She needed to see if anything remained of her workshop. "Stay here," she told her daughters, leaving them in the relative safety of Moorfields. "I'll return by nightfall." The journey proved treacherous. Many streets were blocked by debris or unstable structures. The ground radiated heat through shoe leather in places, requiring careful navigation. Yet Sybil wasn't alone in making this perilous pilgrimage. Across the fire zone, people were cautiously returning, peering into the skeletons of their homes and businesses, hoping against hope to find something salvageable. What they found would haunt them forever. The fire's intensity had been so complete that many areas were reduced to scorched foundations, entire neighborhoods erased as if they'd never existed. "It's like walking through a foreign city," one day's survivor remarked. "I don't recognize anything." The disorientation went beyond physical surroundings. The mental maps of their lives, the familiar landmarks that oriented daily routines, had vanished completely. When Sybil reached Christ's Hospital, she found partial destruction. The fire had burned right up to the complex's edge before being contained. Her living quarters were gone, roof collapsed, interior gutted, but the storeroom where she kept leather and larger tools had miraculously survived, protected by a thick stone wall that acted as a firebreak. It wasn't much, But it was something. A foundation. A beginning. "Find anything worth saving?" asked a familiar voice. Margaret, a seamstress who'd lived nearby, stood holding a small bundle, scissors, and a singed bolt of linen. "Not much," Sybil admitted, wiping ash from her salvaged tools. "But enough to start again." In those simple words, "start again," lay the essence of London's response to catastrophe. Not resignation, but resilience. Not defeat, but determination. This attitude, practical, forward-looking, stubbornly optimistic, would characterize the city's rebuilding efforts. Londoners didn't waste time lamenting what was lost. They focused on what remained and how to build upon it. Of course, urgent necessities drove this mindset. Winter approached. People needed shelter, food, work. There was no luxury for extended mourning when survival itself was at stake. But there was also something quintessentially London in this response. A toughness, a pragmatism forged through centuries of plagues, fires, and political upheavals. By Thursday afternoon, the king and his advisors were shifting focus from firefighting to recovery. At Whitehall Palace, they drafted plans for immediate relief and long-term reconstruction. "We must establish temporary markets immediately," Charles declared. "People need food at fair prices." Within hours, royal proclamations established 8 emergency markets in fields surrounding the city, with price controls to prevent profiteering. Public buildings and churches that had survived were ordered to open as shelters. Tents and building materials were to be distributed for temporary housing. But larger questions loomed. How would London itself be rebuilt? Christopher Wren, the king's surveyor and visionary architect, presented ambitious plans for a new London. Wide streets in grid patterns, grand squares, buildings of brick and stone rather than timber. "This is our opportunity," Wren argued, spreading his drawings before the king. "We can create a modern city worthy of your majesty's reign." Other architects proposed even more radical redesigns. Yet these sweeping visions faced significant obstacles. Legal complexities around property rights. Who owned the land beneath burned buildings? Would original property lines be respected? How to adjudicate disputes between landlords and tenants? Then there was the astronomical cost. Who would pay? The crown? The city? Individual property owners? These debates would rage for months. But even as they deliberated, Londoners began rebuilding on their own initiative, sometimes without waiting for official plans or permissions. Our banker Robert Viner exemplified this entrepreneurial spirit. Though he'd lost several properties, his wealth and connections allowed quick recovery. "We'll establish temporary offices here," he told his steward, indicating a location just outside the burned district. "Begin offering rebuilding loans immediately." Viner understood what every shrewd investor knows. Disasters create opportunities. Those with capital to lend would profit handsomely from London's reconstruction. This disaster capitalism had its dark side: predatory lending, land grabs from desperate sellers, but also served a functional purpose. Private capital, motivated by profit, would drive reconstruction faster than any government program could. It was the same paradox seen in every major disaster: exploitation and renewal existing side by side. For Sybil the shoemaker, recovery proved more modest but achievable. She'd lost her home but saved her tools, the essential ingredients of her trade. By October, she'd secured space in a shared workshop near Smithfield, outside the burned area. "We were fortunate to salvage these," she told her daughter, showing the carefully wrapped shoe lasts, wooden forms shaped like feet that were essential to her craft. Each represented hours of skilled labor. Having them meant she could resume work immediately. In the competitive scramble to rebuild, such small advantages made all the difference. Joshua the bookseller faced the steepest climb. Having lost everything, his inventory, shop, business records, he spent weeks paralyzed by despair. The book trade centered around St. Paul's churchyard had been particularly devastated. Then came an unexpected lifeline. Robert Hooke, the brilliant scientist helping coordinate London's reconstruction, sought Joshua out in Moorfields. Gresham College received book donations from continental scholars, Hooke explained. "We need someone knowledgeable to catalog them. Temporary work, but it's a start. For Joshua, this chance connection proved transformative. His work at Gresham introduced him to London's scientific community, connections that later helped him reopen not as a general bookseller, but as a specialist in scientific works near the Royal Society. Sometimes catastrophe forces reinvention that leads to unexpected success. By Thursday evening, the refugee camps began showing signs of organization, food distribution points, cleaner water sources, basic sanitation measures. And throughout these makeshift communities, people formed the bonds that would sustain them through coming hardships. Neighbors who'd fled together stayed together, sharing resources, maintaining social ties that defined their pre-fire lives. Saved some bread. Sybil told a family near her shelter in Moorfields. Enough to share. These small acts of kindness, multiplied thousands of times across the camps, created networks of mutual aid that helped many survive who might otherwise have perished. Not everyone was so fortunate. The elderly, the sick, the very young would die in coming weeks from exposure and disease, but the collective will to endure remained strong. As Thursday turned to Friday, the immediate fire danger had largely passed. Small fires still burned, but were being systematically extinguished. New challenges emerged: collapsed buildings, contaminated wells, disease risks in overcrowded camps. The crisis had changed phases, from acute emergency to long-term recovery, bringing new opportunities for both public service and private enterprise. Brickmakers ramped up production. Timber merchants secured supplies. Builders assembled crews. Within days of containment, the first rebuilding contracts were signed. Within weeks, construction began on some sites. Within months, parts of the burned district became active building sites, new structures rising from ashes. This pace of recovery seems astonishing today. Without modern insurance systems or government relief programs, London rebuilt itself through a combination of individual initiative and collective effort. By late 1666, the initial shock had given way to determined rebuilding. The burned area remained largely wasteland, but a few structures rose from ruins. Most displaced Londoners still lived temporarily, in camps, hastily built shacks, or crowded into homes of relatives in undamaged areas. Winter's approach added urgency. The king ordered emergency shelters built on city outskirts, but demand far outstripped supply. Many left London entirely, swelling populations in provincial towns or suburbs like Clerkenwell and Southwark. For those remaining near the burned district, conditions stayed difficult: streets littered with debris, air thick with ash, ground still radiating heat in places. Yet amid these hardships, progress emerged. The king had appointed a reconstruction commission led by Wren and Hooke, who established new building codes: wider streets, brick or stone construction, limits on overhanging upper stories. In February 1667, a special fire court convened to settle landlord-tenant disputes that could have stalled rebuilding for years. By spring 1667, reconstruction was properly underway. Main streets cleared, property boundaries re-established, first new buildings rising. Progress was uneven. Wealthier areas recovered faster. Public buildings got priority funding, but brick by brick, London was remaking itself. And in the process, becoming something new, not just physically but socially, economically, psychologically. The medieval city was gone. What would emerge from its ashes? That story was just beginning. The year 1667 dawned on a London that barely resembled its former self. Where once the medieval city had stood crammed within its ancient walls, now stretched a vast wasteland of ash and scorched stone. Over 400 acres of destruction radiating outward from Pudding Lane like some monstrous black flower. The stench of wet charcoal still hung over everything, mingling with the acrid tang of burnt metals and the ever-present wood smoke from countless small fires still smoldering beneath the ruins. Winter rains had turned ash piles into gray sludge that clung stubbornly to boots and hems as people picked their way through the devastation. Yet even in this bleak landscape, signs of renewal pushed stubbornly through the destruction. Makeshift workshops had sprung up along the edges of the burned district. Carpenters, masons, and bricklayers already at work rebuilding what they could. The rhythmic tap-tap-tap of hammers on stone provided a hopeful counterpoint to the occasional crash of unstable walls collapsing inward. Every intact building near the fire zone had become temporary housing, its rooms subdivided and crammed with multiple families. The sound of coughing, that persistent, wet, post-fire cough, could be heard everywhere as people's lungs struggled to clear themselves of smoke and ash. Our shoemaker Sybil Tame had secured a corner in one such overcrowded house near Smithfield, paying dearly for the privilege. 3 shillings a week just to sleep on floorboards, she grumbled to her daughters as they arranged their meager belongings in the 8 by 10 foot space they now called home. But it was better than the fields, especially now that January frosts had begun silvering the ground each morning. Her salvaged tools lay wrapped in oilcloth beneath their straw sleeping mat, protected as carefully as any treasure. Across town in his temporary office near Holborn, banker Robert Viner reviewed loan applications with his steward. The demand for rebuilding capital far exceeded even his optimistic projections. "We'll need to raise interest rates another half-point," he remarked, tapping the ledgers showing their dwindling coin reserves. "And prioritize merchants who can provide their own bricks. The brickyards can't keep up with demand." The fire had been catastrophic for many, but for men like Viner who controlled capital, it presented unprecedented opportunities. Every loan he issued now would be repaid with interest for years to come, secured by property that would only increase in value as London rebuilt. Meanwhile, near the ruins of St. Paul's, Joshua Curtin sorted through a shipment of books that had just arrived from Amsterdam, part of the donation from continental scholars that had given him a lifeline. The volumes smelled of sea salt and printer's ink rather than smoke, a small miracle. "This Euclid's geometry is worth £5 at least," he murmured, carefully wiping the leather cover. His hands still shook slightly when he worked near open flames, a lingering effect of that terrible night watching the cathedral burn. But the work grounded him, these tangible connections to the world of learning that the fire couldn't destroy. The physical rebuilding of London proceeded in fits and starts that winter. Christopher Wren's grand vision for a redesigned city had quickly collided with practical realities. Property owners demanded to rebuild on their original plots, regardless of new street plans. The fire court, established to adjudicate disputes, found itself overwhelmed with cases as landlords and tenants argued over who should bear rebuilding costs. By February, compromises emerged. Main thoroughfares would be widened somewhat, but the medieval street pattern largely remained. New buildings must be of brick or stone with tile roofs, their upper floors forbidden from overhanging the streets as before. These modest reforms still represented a revolution in urban planning. The Great Fire had accomplished what no civic authority could have, sweeping away the tangled medieval city in one catastrophic clean slate. Now, as spring approached, the rhythm of hammers and saws grew louder each day. Teams of scavengers, mostly women and children, picked through ruins for reusable materials, earning pennies for every load of salvaged nails, hinges, or intact bricks they delivered to building sites. The clatter of carts carrying fresh bricks from kilns in the countryside became a constant background noise. For Sybil, this rebuilding boom brought both opportunity and frustration. Her new workshop near Smithfield attracted customers. People always needed shoes, fire or no fire, but materials cost 3 times what they had before. Leather's scarce because all the tanneries burned, she explained to a customer shocked by her prices. And half my tools were ruined by the heat. Still, she counted herself fortunate. Walking through the burned district each Sunday, she saw former neighbors still living in tents, their trades impossible to practice without workshops or tools. By April, the first completed buildings began appearing, sturdy brick structures with symmetrical facades that would have looked modern even before the fire. The wealthy rebuilt fastest. A magnificent new Royal Exchange rose on the ashes of the old, its stone columns gleaming in the spring sunlight. But for every finished building, a dozen more stood half-completed, their timber skeletons awaiting brickwork as builders struggled with material shortages. The human cost of the fire became clearer as warmer weather arrived. Parish registers showed a spike in deaths that winter, not from the flames themselves, but from exposure, disease, and the brutal conditions in refugee camps. The poor suffered most, of course. Many who had rented homes before the fire now found themselves priced out of the rebuilt city, forced into overcrowded slums or distant suburbs. The fire had destroyed not just buildings, but entire ways of life. The intricate networks of alleyway workshops and street markets that had characterized medieval London. Yet for all this suffering, the city's spirit proved remarkably resilient. By summer, markets bustled again, though now in temporary wooden stalls rather than permanent buildings. The theaters reopened, their performances drawing crowds eager for distraction. Coffee houses, those crucibles of Enlightenment ideas, resumed their debates, though now in borrowed spaces. Londoners adapted with that peculiar mix of pragmatism and humor that crises often reveal. A popular joke circulating that summer asked, "How do you recognize a Londoner?" The answer, they still turn their head to check for smoke whenever someone shouts fire. For Robert Viner, the summer of 1667 brought professional triumph. His bank had financed nearly a quarter of the rebuilding loans issued thus far, securing his position as one of London's most influential financiers. In June, he hosted a dinner party at his nearly completed new home, one of the first great houses rebuilt after the fire. The guest list included Wren, Hooke, and other members of the rebuilding commission. Over roasted pheasant and imported wine, they debated London's future. "We should take this opportunity to install proper sewers," Hooke argued, sketching designs on the tablecloth with a piece of chalk. The old system was medieval, literally. Viner nodded thoughtfully. "The challenge is funding. The city's coffers are empty after paying for street widening." His mind already calculated potential revenue streams, perhaps a tax on rebuilt properties. The fire had destroyed so much, but it had also burned away obstacles to modernization that would have taken decades to overcome otherwise. Across town, Joshua Curtin's specialized bookshop near the Royal Society was thriving in its own modest way. The scientific community's enthusiasm for rebuilding their libraries had given him a steady stream of customers. That June evening, he unpacked a newly arrived shipment from Leiden, a treatise on microscopy by Antony van Leeuwenhoek. As he carefully shelved the volume, he marveled at how his life had changed. Before the fire, he'd been just another bookseller among dozens near St. Paul's. Now he was known as the scholar's bookseller, his expertise sought out by England's brightest minds. The fire had taken much, but it had also cleared space for unexpected new growth. Sybil's daughters had found work too, the eldest apprenticed to a glovemaker, the younger helping in the workshop. Business was steady enough that Sybil could finally replace some of her lost tools. On Midsummer's Day, she treated her girls to roasted chestnuts from a street vendor, their first small luxury since the fire. As they walked along Fleet Street, now bustling with rebuilding activity, the youngest suddenly asked, "Do you think London will ever be the same?" Sybil considered the question as she watched a team of masons hoist a carved stone block onto a new building. "No," she said finally. "Not the same. Maybe better." There was truth in that simple observation. The London rising from the ashes would be different, more fireproof, more modern, more aware of its own fragility. The fire had scarred the city, but scars are just another kind of strength. By autumn 1667, the pace of rebuilding accelerated. The fire court's decisions had cleared most legal obstacles. Brick production finally caught up with demand. Skilled craftsmen flocked to London from across England and Europe, drawn by high wages. The city's population, which had temporarily dropped after the fire, now surged past its pre-fire numbers as newcomers arrived seeking work. The physical transformation became visible week by week. Where blackened ruins had stood in spring, now rose orderly rows of brick buildings with uniform facades. The new regulations gave rebuilt London a cleaner, more modern appearance than the jumbled medieval city had ever possessed. Main streets like Cheapside and Fleet Street were noticeably wider, allowing sunlight to reach ground level for the first time in centuries. Yet for all this progress, Reminders of the fire remained everywhere. Charred stumps of church spires still punctuated the skyline. Empty lots marked where buildings had not yet been reconstructed. The skeletal remains of St. Paul's Cathedral dominated the city center, its ruins too massive to quickly clear. And everywhere, in the soot stains that still clung to surviving walls, in the occasional whiff of smoke that rose from long-burnt timbers, in the nightmares that still woke survivors in the dead of night, the fire's presence lingered. For London's poor, recovery remained precarious. The rebuilt city was more expensive, its new brick houses beyond the means of many who had rented wooden cottages before the fire. The lanes and alleys that had once housed entire communities of artisans remained empty, their former residents scattered to the city's outskirts. The fire had not just destroyed buildings. It had disrupted the intricate social and economic ecosystems that had sustained London's working classes for generations. Yet even here, resilience showed itself in unexpected ways. Former neighbors found each other in the sprawling city, recreating fragments of their lost communities. Craftsmen shared tools and workshop space. Market vendors extended credit to struggling customers. The same networks of mutual aid that had helped people survive the immediate aftermath of the fire now helped them rebuild their lives. As winter approached again in late 1667, London faced its first cold season since the fire with cautious optimism. The worst hardships had passed. The city was undeniably changed, physically, socially, economically, but it was undeniably alive. The Great Fire had tested London as few events in its long history had done. It had revealed both the fragility and the astonishing resilience of a great city and its people. And it had set in motion changes that would shape London for centuries to come, transforming it from a medieval town into the modern metropolis that would one day become the heart of an empire. But that was all in the future. For now, as the first snowflakes of winter dusted the new brick roofs of London, the city's people could look around at what they had accomplished in just 1 year and take pride. They had faced catastrophe and not been broken. They had lost much but preserved what mattered most: their lives, their community, their indomitable spirit. The fire had taken their city, but it had not taken London from them. That distinction would prove more important than any of them could have imagined. 5 years after the flames had finally died, London stood reborn, but not as it was. The city that emerged from the ashes of 1666 bore only a skeletal resemblance to its medieval predecessor. Where crooked timber-framed houses had once leaned precariously over narrow lanes, now stood orderly rows of brick buildings with uniform facades. The main thoroughfares, Cheapside, Fleet Street, Cornhill, had been widened just enough to let sunlight reach the ground for the first time in centuries. And towering over it all rose the skeletal beginnings of Christopher Wren's new St. Paul's Cathedral, its half-finished dome already redefining the city's skyline. Our shoemaker Sybil Tame walked down Ludgate Hill one crisp October morning in 1671, her boots clicking against the new stone pavement. 5 years had etched deeper lines around her eyes, but also given her the sturdy confidence of a woman who'd rebuilt her life twice over. Her workshop near Smithfield now employed 3 apprentices, including her eldest daughter, and supplied shoes to merchants across London. The fire that had taken her home had also, in some strange way, given her opportunities she'd never have had in the old city. "Mind the step, mistress," called a workman as she passed the construction site where Wren's cathedral was rising. She nodded thanks, glancing up at the intricate stonework where masons perched like birds on scaffolding. The changes weren't just architectural. The very rhythm of London life had altered in subtle ways. The fire had burned away not just buildings, but old certainties, old ways of doing things. People carried themselves differently now, a little less reckless, a little more aware of life's fragility. You could see it in how carefully housewives banked their hearth fires, how quickly crowds formed at the first shout of fire, no matter how small the blaze. The city had developed what we'd now call PTSD, a collective flinch at any reminder of that terrible week. At the Royal Exchange, rebuilt in grander style than before, Banker Robert Viner conducted business in his new offices overlooking the trading floor. The fire had made him richer than he'd ever dreamed, his loans financing nearly a third of the city's reconstruction. But it had cost him too. His first wife had died in the plague year before the fire, and the double trauma had left him with a persistent cough that no physician could cure. Still, he reflected as he signed another loan document. The fire had been the making of modern London and modern financiers like himself. The new brick buildings were worth more than the old wooden ones. The wider streets made trade easier. The standardized construction reduced insurance risks, a new industry that had sprung up after the fire. Disaster, it turned out, could be excellent for business, if you had the capital to capitalize on it. Down near the temple, bookseller Joshua Curtin unpacked a crate of books shipped from Paris, treatises on mathematics and natural philosophy for his discerning clientele at the Royal Society. His shop had become a gathering place for London's intellectual elite, a far cry from the general bookstore he'd run near Old St. Paul's. Sometimes, when the light fell just so, he could still smell smoke on the pages of certain volumes, books salvaged from other collections, bearing invisible scars of the fire. He developed a specialty in such rescued books, finding buyers who appreciated their history as much as their contents. The fire had taken his livelihood once, but given him back something richer, a purpose, a place in the Republic of Letters. Not everyone had fared so well. Walking home that evening, Sybil passed the makeshift shelters still housing hundreds near Moorfields. 5 years on, some people had never recovered. The fire had been particularly cruel to those without property or capital to rebuild with. Many of the old neighborhood networks, the informal systems of credit and mutual aid that had sustained artisans and laborers, had been permanently disrupted. The city's poor now clustered in new slums beyond the old walls, their lives rendered even more precarious by London's rebuilding. The social fabric had changed in other ways too. The fire had accelerated trends that might have taken decades otherwise. The strict guild controls that had governed trades like Sybil's were weakening under the pressure of reconstruction. Newcomers from across England and Europe, many with different techniques and ideas, had flooded in to help rebuild. The result was a ferment of innovation and competition that would eventually make London the workshop of the world. You could see it in Sybil's own workshop, where her daughter was experimenting with new French methods of stitching that made shoes both stronger and more flexible. "It's not how father did it," the girl had said when first proposing the idea. Sybil had smiled. "Your father was a fine shoemaker, but the world's changed since his day." That simple statement might have been the fire's true legacy, the understanding that change wasn't just inevitable, but could be harnessed, turned to advantage. Wren's grand vision for London had only been partially realized, of course. The wide boulevards and grand squares of his original plan had mostly given way to practical compromises with property owners and city fathers. But the new building codes, requiring brick walls, tile roofs, properly spaced structures, had already prevented several smaller fires from becoming catastrophes. The lessons of 1666 had been written into the very fabric of the city. Nowhere was this more evident than in the new St. Paul's rising slowly from the ashes of the old. Wren had seized the opportunity to create not just a church, but a symbol, a statement about London's resilience and ambition. Sybil paused often to watch its progress, marveling at how the great dome took shape stone by painstaking stone. It would take decades to complete, she knew, likely the rest of her lifetime. But that was fitting somehow. Rebuilding wasn't just about replacing what was lost. It was about creating something worthy of the sacrifice. For all the progress, reminders of the fire were everywhere if you knew where to look. In the occasional half-burned beam still embedded in a rebuilt structure. In the way rain pooled in odd depressions where cellars had been filled in hastily. In the stories old men told in taverns, their voices still catching decades later when they described the flames. The fire had become part of London's DNA, a shared experience that bound its people together even as it had scattered them temporarily. The city's relationship with fire itself had changed profoundly. Where once Londoners had accepted periodic fires as inevitable, now they fought every blaze with organized determination. The city maintained proper fire engines and trained crews. Neighborhoods organized bucket brigades. Building materials were carefully regulated. The memory of 1666 kept vigilance high, though already a new generation was growing up for whom the Great Fire was just a story told by elders. Perhaps the most profound change was psychological. The fire had burned away London's medieval mindset along with its medieval buildings. The city that emerged was more modern, more forward-looking, more open to innovation in everything from architecture to finance to science. The Royal Society flourished in this new climate, its members, many of whom had lost libraries and instruments in the fire, rebuilding their collections with even grander ambitions. Joshua saw this firsthand in his bookshop, where the demand for works on architecture, engineering, and the new natural philosophy far outstripped the market for old-fashioned theology and classics. The fire had, in a sense, burned away intellectual as well as physical constraints. London's thinkers were no longer content with received wisdom. They wanted to understand and improve their world, to rebuild it better than before. By 1675, when the first section of Rennes St. Paul's was consecrated, London had largely completed its physical recovery. The burned area was fully rebuilt, though construction continued on major projects like the cathedral and the dozens of parish churches Rennes designed to replace those lost. The city's population had not just recovered but grown, surpassing its pre-fire numbers. Trade flourished. The streets, while still crowded, no longer felt like tinderboxes waiting for a spark. Yet for all this progress, the fire's legacy remained complex. The rebuilt London was cleaner, safer, more modern, but also more expensive, more stratified. The poor had been pushed to the margins, their lives rendered more precarious by rising rents and the loss of traditional communities. The fire had, in a sense, accelerated the growth of London as a commercial powerhouse, while weakening its older, more communal ways of life. Walking along the Thames one evening, Sybil paused to watch the sun set behind the half-built dome of St. Paul's. The river reflected the orange light in a way that uncomfortably recalled the fire's glow. 5 years on, the memories still came unbidden sometimes. The heat, the smoke, the terrible roar of collapsing buildings. But alongside those memories came others, the neighbors who'd shared their food, the strangers who'd helped carry her tools, the stubborn determination that had seen them all through. London had been tested as few cities ever are, not just by flames, but by the daunting task of rebuilding. And it had emerged transformed, for better and worse. The medieval city was gone forever. In its place stood something new, something that bore the marks of its traumatic birth, but was no less remarkable for that. The fire had taken much, but it had also revealed the resilience at London's heart, a resilience that would carry the city through future trials none could yet imagine. As Sybil turned for home, the first lamps were being lit along the streets, no longer the flickering torches of old, but new oil lamps designed to burn brighter and safer. Their light fell on brick walls that would resist fire, on wider streets that would slow its spread, on a people who would never again take their city's safety for granted. The Great Fire had been a tragedy, yes, but also, in some strange way, the making of modern London. A decade after the flames had cooled, London stood transformed, a phoenix city risen from its own ashes in ways both visible and invisible. The physical changes were obvious to any observer. The towering bulk of St. Paul's Cathedral nearing completion, its great dome now dominating the skyline. The orderly rows of brick houses with their identical facades lining widened streets. The new public buildings constructed with fireproof materials and modern conveniences. But beneath this surface modernization ran deeper currents of change in how Londoners lived, worked, and thought about their city. Our shoemaker Sybil Tame, now in her early 50s, walked through the rebuilt streets with the confident stride of a woman who owned property, something unimaginable before the fire had cleared away the old tenement systems. Her workshop near Smithfield had expanded to occupy an entire building, with 6 apprentices working under her supervision. The fire that had destroyed her modest livelihood had paradoxically created opportunities, The old guild restrictions had loosened during Reconstruction, allowing her to grow her business beyond what would have been permitted in the pre-fire world. "We ship to Bristol now," she told a customer proudly, showing off a pair of boots made with innovative stitching techniques her daughter had learned from French craftsmen. The city's commercial heart had not just recovered but expanded beyond its medieval boundaries. The Royal Exchange bustled with traders from across Europe and beyond, their transactions facilitated by bankers like Robert Viner, who had grown rich financing London's rebirth. Viner's offices now occupied an entire floor of a brand new building on Threadneedle Street, its walls adorned with maps charting the global reach of British trade. The fire had accelerated trends that might have taken generations: standardized contracts, insurance policies, joint stock companies. All innovations born from the necessity of rebuilding an entire metropolis. Risk must be quantified, Viner often told his younger associates, tapping the actuarial tables that were his pride. The fire had taught London this lesson brutally. Now insurers calculated premiums based on building materials and neighborhood firefighting capabilities. What had been chaos was being tamed by numbers and systems, the city's rebirth giving birth to modern finance itself. Down near the temple, Joshua Curtin's bookshop had become an unofficial annex to the Royal Society. The shelves groaned under the weight of scientific treatises, Newton's groundbreaking works on light and motion, Hooke's Micrographia with its stunning engravings of the microscopic world, imported volumes from Descartes and Leibniz. The fire that had destroyed his original inventory had cleared space for this specialized trade, just as it had cleared London's intellectual landscape for new ideas. "We've received the Principia you ordered," Joshua told a breathless young scholar one morning in 1687, handing over Newton's revolutionary work. The student clutched it like a sacred text, which, in a way, it was. The old certainties had burned with the old city. Now London's thinkers were rebuilding knowledge itself from first principles. The physical reminders of the fire were fading but still present if you knew where to look. Along some rebuilt streets, careful observers could spot the occasional half-charred beam incorporated into new structures, not from poverty, but as deliberate memorials. The monument, Wren's towering column commemorating the fire, had been completed in 1677, its height matching its distance from the bakery where the fire began. Visitors could climb its 311 steps to gaze upon the transformed city, though some complained the experience triggered vertigo. More subtle reminders lingered in London's collective psyche, the way crowds still reacted sharply to any shout of fire, the extra care taken with hearths and candles, the persistent nightmares that visited survivors on hot summer nights. For all its progress, the rebuilt London had its shadows. The poor had been pushed to the city's fringes, their traditional neighborhoods replaced with more expensive housing. The lanes and alleys that had once teemed with artisans and small traders now housed a wealthier class of shopkeepers and clerks. The fire had, in a sense, gentrified London, a process that created opportunities for some while leaving others permanently displaced. Sybil saw this whenever she visited her sister's family in the crowded tenements of Whitechapel, where former neighbors from the old parish had ended up after being priced out of the rebuilt city. Yet even here, resilience flourished. The same networks of mutual aid that had helped people survive the fire's immediate aftermath now helped them adapt to these new circumstances. Former neighbors recreated fragments of their lost communities in the city's outskirts, sharing resources and information. The fire had scattered them, but not broken their connections entirely. London's relationship with authority had changed too. The heroic efforts of King Charles and the Duke of York during the fire had created a reservoir of goodwill toward the crown that lasted years. But the city's government had also emerged stronger. Its handling of the reconstruction, particularly through the fire court system, had proven its competence. A new balance of power was emerging between monarch and municipality, one that would shape London's governance for generations. The rebuilt city's defenses against fire were now the envy of Europe. An organized firefighting force patrolled the streets, equipped with improved engines and leather hoses. Neighborhoods maintained their own bucket brigades, drilling regularly. Building codes were strictly enforced. No more thatched roofs or overhanging upper stories. The lessons of 1666 had been written into law and custom alike. Perhaps most remarkably, London had avoided major fires for nearly 20 years, a testament to these reforms. Small blazes still broke out regularly, of course, but none had become catastrophes. The city had learned to live with fire, respecting its dangers while no longer being terrorized by them. This hard-won equilibrium was visible in everyday details. The firehooks kept neatly by every parish church, the watchmen trained to sound alarms at the first whiff of smoke, the public water tanks strategically placed throughout the city. By the 1690s, a generation was coming of age for whom the Great Fire was history rather than memory. They walked streets their parents had seen burn, shopped in markets that had been ash piles in their childhoods, worshipped in Wren's elegant new churches that replaced the medieval ones lost to flames. The trauma was fading, though its lessons remained embedded in the city's fabric and institutions. For Sybil, now a grandmother teaching her craft to a new generation, the fire had become both a defining memory and a distant one. Sometimes, when she passed the monument or caught an unexpected whiff of wood smoke, the memories would flood back. The heat, the terror, the desperate scramble to save her tools. But more often, she marveled at how the disaster had reshaped her life in ways she could never have anticipated. The fire had taken her home, but given her a business. It had destroyed her neighborhood, but broadened her horizons. It had been the worst week of her life, and also, strangely, the making of her. Robert Viner rarely spoke of the fire anymore, though its influence shaped his every decision. The banking empire he'd built from the ashes now spanned continents, financing trade routes that stretched from the Caribbean to the East Indies. The financial instruments he'd pioneered during the Reconstruction, insurance policies, standardized loans, joint stock ventures, had become standard practice. The fire had taught him that catastrophe could be planned for, its risks calculated and mitigated. This insight had made him one of the richest men in England. Joshua Curtin had turned his near ruin into a different kind of legacy. His bookshop had become a hub for London's intellectual life, a place where Newton's revolutionary ideas mingled with Hooke's ingenious inventions and Halley's astronomical calculations. The fire that had destroyed his original inventory had cleared space for this specialized trade, just as it had cleared London's intellectual landscape for new ideas. Sometimes, when he handled a particularly rare volume salvage from some other collection, he would catch the faintest scent of smoke, a reminder that knowledge, like cities, could rise from ashes. As the 17th century waned, London stood on the cusp of its future as a global capital. The fire had been a crucible, testing and transforming the city in ways both painful and profound. The medieval town was gone forever. In its place stood something new, more modern, more resilient, more open to change. The fire had taken much, but it had also revealed strengths Londoners never knew they possessed, a capacity for reinvention that would carry the city through the coming century's challenges. Walking along the Thames one evening in 1698, Sybil paused to watch the sun set behind Wren's completed masterpiece. St. Paul's dome glowed golden in the fading light, a symbol of all London had endured and achieved. The river carried ships from around the world now, their cargoes fueling a commercial empire the medieval city could scarcely have imagined. The fire had been the end of one London and the beginning of another. And as the first stars appeared above the cathedral's cross, Sybil smiled at the thought that her grandchildren would inherit a city transformed, not despite the fire, but in some ways because of it. By the turn of the 18th century, London had not just recovered from the Great Fire. It had ascended as the beating heart of a burgeoning empire. The flames that had devoured its medieval core now seemed, in hindsight, like a brutal but necessary purification, a fiery baptism into modernity. The rebuilt city thrummed with an energy that would have been unrecognizable before 1666, its streets alive with merchants trading goods from continents that barely registered on pre-fire maps. Robert Viner, now silver-haired and leaning on an ivory-tipped cane, surveyed this transformation from the balcony of his Threadneedle Street offices. His bank had financed voyages to Madras, Jamaica, and the Carolinas, ventures that would have seemed fantastical when he'd first scrambled to save his ledgers from the flames. Insure the cargo at 12%, he instructed his clerks, reviewing a shipment manifest for Virginia Tobacco. The fire had taught him the mathematics of risk. Now he applied those lessons globally. Below his window, the Royal Exchange buzzed with traders speaking broken English through Dutch, Portuguese, and Arabic accents. The smell of coffee, a novelty in 1666, wafted from nearby coffee houses where underwriters drafted policies covering everything from pirate attacks to hurricanes. This mercantile explosion owed unexpected deaths to the fire. The insurance industry, born from the ashes of 1666, now lubricated global trade. Standardized contracts developed during Reconstruction had become templates for transatlantic commerce. Even London's brick-and-mortar aesthetic, originally mandated for fire safety, projected solidity that attracted foreign investors. "They trust our walls won't burn," Viner mused, watching a Huguenot silk merchant negotiate with a Lancashire wool dealer. The very trauma that had nearly destroyed London had forged tools for domination. Meanwhile, near the fully completed St. Paul's Cathedral, Joshua Curtin's bookshop had become a clearinghouse for knowledge fueling this expansion. Sailors brought back botanical sketches from the Amazon, accounts of Mughal architecture, and star charts from the Southern Hemisphere, all eagerly purchased by Royal Society members. "This arrived from the Massachusetts colony," Joshua told a customer, unwrapping a treatise on timber fortifications. The scent of ink and fresh paper had long overlaid the ghostly whiff of smoke in his shop, though he still kept one charred volume under glass, a relic and reminder. The fire's legacy lived on in subtler ways too. Rennes Cathedral, with its soaring dome visible to ships miles down the Thames, served as both spiritual compass and navigational landmark for the growing merchant fleet. The precise street grids laid during Reconstruction made London unervingly legible to foreign traders compared to the maze-like medieval city. Even the fire hooks kept by every parish had evolved into standardized equipment aboard East India Company ships. Yet this global ascendancy cast shadows. The same financial systems that had rebuilt London now ensnared it in distant calamities. When news arrived in 1720 that speculative investments in South American silver mines had collapsed, the infamous South Sea Bubble, Viner recognized the same reckless greed that had once made Pudding Lane's baker skimp on oven maintenance. "Fires spread differently now," he muttered, watching panicked investors mob the exchange. The conflagrations were financial, but the panic felt eerily familiar. For Sybil Tame's grandchildren, inheriting her expanded workshop, the fire had receded into legend. They walked streets where the occasional surviving pre-fire structure stood out like a missing tooth, a crooked half-timbered house spared by some quirk of wind or geography. The apprentices no longer started at the cry of fire. They'd grown up with organized bucket brigades and insured brick buildings. Yet when the Great Frost of 1709 iced over the Thames, the old fears resurfaced as families huddled around meager hearths, their breath fogging in unheated rooms. Cold could kill as surely as flame, and London's poor still suffered first and worst. The city's physical transformation was now so complete that tourists came specifically to admire Rennes' masterpiece dome and the monument's intricate bas-reliefs depicting the fire. An entire industry of guidebooks and walking tours had sprung up around disaster tourism, a phenomenon that would have baffled survivors who'd carried the stench of burnt flesh in their nostrils for weeks. "Observe where the flames leaped the Fleet River," a popular guide instructed, as if the scorched earth were a theatrical set rather than a mass grave for lost homes. In the coffee houses where merchants, scientists, and writers mingled, the fire had become rhetorical shorthand. Political pamphlets warned of financial conflagrations consuming honest tradesmen. Sermons described hellfire with suspiciously specific references to melting lead and collapsing spires. The trauma had been metabolized into London's collective consciousness, its lessons both applied and distorted. Most remarkably, the rebuilt city had avoided major fires for over 4 decades, a testament to its new infrastructure and vigilance. The organized firefighting force established after 1666 had become a point of civic pride, their polished engines paraded annually on the fire's anniversary. Building codes once resisted as costly now commanded premiums. A brick house in Cheapside was worth triple its pre-fire wooden predecessor. The very definition of value had been rewritten by the flames. As Viner walked home past the docks one evening in 1715, he paused to watch sailors unload spices from Ceylon and furs from Canada, goods that would have been exotic luxuries before the fire. The lanterns of hundreds of ships bobbed in the Thames, their reflected light dancing like the ghost of that other great illumination half a century prior. London had been reforged in those flames, not just its buildings, but its soul. The city that emerged was harder, smarter, and infinitely more ambitious. A phoenix with soot-stained feathers and eyes fixed on the horizon. As the 18th century progressed, the Great Fire of London transitioned from living memory into cultural mythology. For the grandchildren of survivors, the catastrophe became less a traumatic event and more an origin story, a foundational myth about the city's resilience. The flames that had once terrified now fascinated, their retelling shaped by nostalgia and national pride. London had not just survived the fire, it had weaponized the memory of it. The monument, that towering Doric column designed by Wren, became the physical anchor for this cultural transformation. By the 1730s, visitors could purchase penny pamphlets at its base recounting the dreadful conflagration in sensational detail. Hawkers sold tin souvenirs shaped like firehooks, their crude engravings depicting heroic citizens battling the blaze. Up close, the column's bas-relief panels told an official version of events, the fire as tragic accident, the rebuilding as civic triumph. But if one looked carefully at the western panel, a subtle narrative emerged. A woman representing London knelt not in defeat, but in renewal, her phoenix crest rising defiantly above the flames. This sanitized version of history permeated popular culture. At Drury Lane Theatre, a popular pantomime called The London Phoenix depicted the fire as a comic misunderstanding between a bumbling baker and a mischievous kitchen maid. The flames became mere backdrop for slapstick routines, actors in flame-colored ribbons dancing while the hero, a thinly disguised Wren, waved a miniature St. Paul's like a magic wand. Survivors who attended these performances found them equal parts amusing and unsettling, their nightmares repackaged as entertainment. More thoughtful memorials existed for those who knew where to look. In the rebuilt churches, careful observers could find small plaques commemorating parishioners who had died not from the flames directly, but in the harsh winter that followed. The chapel of the Mercer's Company displayed a charred Bible salvage from their original hall, its pages fused together into a single blackened mass, a silent rebuke to the cheerful narratives elsewhere. Literature, too, grappled with the fire's legacy. Daniel Defoe, who had been a child during the disaster, wove fire imagery throughout his works. In A Journal of the Plague Year, published in 1722 but set in 1665, readers recognized the fire's looming shadow in every description of panicked crowds and collapsing social order. The novel's subtext was clear. The plague had been mere prelude to London's trial by fire, its true transformation. For Robert Viner's descendants now running the family bank, the fire had become corporate lore. New clerks received a leather-bound history detailing how their founders saved the bank's ledgers through heroic exertions during the Great Conflagration, a version of events that grew more dramatic with each retelling. The original scorched account books were displayed in a glass case in the lobby, their survival framed as both miracle and metaphor. What had been desperate improvisation now served as branding. A bank that could survive literal flames would surely weather financial storms. This institutional memory proved unexpectedly useful during the crises that periodically rocked 18th century London. When the Panic of 1772 saw mobs gather outside banks, managers invoked the fire story to reassure depositors. This house has stood since before the flames. It will stand still. The physical continuity of brick-and-mortar buildings became psychological ballast in uncertain times. The fire also left its mark on London's scientific community. At the Royal Society, the near-total destruction of members' libraries and instruments in 1666 had sparked an obsessive culture of preservation. By the 1750s, the Society maintained duplicate archives in country houses, its members insisting, "Never again shall we lose our collective memory." This paranoia birthed innovations, fireproof cabinets, duplicate ledger systems, that later became standard practice in institutions worldwide. Meanwhile, in the rebuilt workshops along Fleet Street, artisans maintained subtler traditions. Glassblowers still taught apprentices to watch for the fire haze in their furnaces, a term borrowed from survivors describing the superheated air that preceded the conflagration. Printers kept buckets of sand rather than water near their presses, a precaution traced to accounts of exploding water barrels in 1666. These occupational rituals formed an invisible web of memory, passed down through generations long after their origins faded. The fire even reshaped London's spiritual landscape. Nonconformist congregations, Baptists, Quakers, and other dissenters, found unexpected acceptance after the disaster, their meeting houses rebuilt alongside Anglican churches. The shared trauma had temporarily overridden theological divisions, creating space for religious diversity that persisted into the next century. As one preacher noted in 1740, the flames made no distinction between Papist and Protestant. Why should we? By the time Samuel Johnson compiled his dictionary in 1755, the fire had fully entered the language. Johnson defined phoenix not just as the mythical bird, but as a symbol of London reborn from ashes. The verb to rebuild carried the secondary meaning to improve upon catastrophe. Even innocent words like pudding now triggered dark humor. Johnson's entry noted dryly that the street of that name was formerly notorious for an unfortunate bakery incident. For ordinary Londoners, the fire's anniversary became an occasion for complex rituals. Some attended church services where preachers warned against moral complacency. Others gathered at the monument to hear firemen recount cautionary tales. But many marked the day privately, lighting candles in windows, a simultaneous memorial and defiance. The wealthiest began a macabre tradition of hosting fire feasts, serving dishes burned black at the edges while musicians played compositions mimicking the crackle of flames. This cultural digestion of trauma reached its zenith in 1763, when a fireworks display commemorating the Treaty of Paris accidentally set ablaze a replica of Old St. Paul's, a wooden model erected for the celebration. As crowds watched the miniature cathedral burn, their reaction split between horror and cathartic laughter. The next day's newspapers struggled to articulate the surreal symbolism. London had recreated its greatest disaster as entertainment, then lost control of the reenactment. The fire, it seemed, would always defy containment, even in memory. By the late 18th century, the fire's physical traces were disappearing. Urban renewal projects paved over the last visible scars. New construction obscured the occasional half-burnt beam still embedded in older structures. The Great Fire was becoming what it remains today, less a historical event than a narrative mirror, reflecting whatever lessons each generation needed to see. Resilience in wartime, vigilance against new threats, the inevitability of change. Yet in quiet moments, the city still betrayed its scars. During the record heat wave of 1794, long-buried cellar walls grew warm to the touch, their stones retaining memories of that long-ago inferno. Elderly residents claimed to smell smoke on windless days. And when the new century dawned with its own disasters, the Napoleonic Wars, industrial accidents, cholera outbreaks, Londoners instinctively reached for fire metaphors to make sense of fresh calamities. The past wasn't dead, it was just waiting for the right spark. As the 19th century dawned, London stood as the capital of a global empire, a metropolis transformed not once, but repeatedly by the legacy of 1666. The Great Fire had become more than history. It was now encoded in the city's DNA, its lessons resurfacing with each new challenge. The flames that had once threatened to erase London instead forged an eternal prototype, the first modern city to stare into the abyss of total destruction and reinvent itself from the ashes. The fire's practical legacy was everywhere visible. The building codes it inspired had become models for cities worldwide. Fire insurance marks, those small metal plaques affixed to buildings, now decorated structures from Boston to Bombay. The organized fire brigades born from London's trauma had evolved into professional municipal services. Even the humble fire hydrant, perfected in the rebuilding years, bore silent witness to the disaster's global impact. But more profound were the psychological imprints. London had demonstrated that a city could endure near-total destruction and emerge stronger, a revelation that shaped urban planning for the industrial age. When Chicago burned in 1871 or San Francisco quaked in 1906, civic leaders turned instinctively to London's playbook: standardized rebuilding, centralized planning, and the marshalling of private capital for public recovery. The DNA of 1666 pulsed in every reconstructed boulevard. The fire's philosophical legacy proved equally enduring. The Enlightenment thinkers who had witnessed London's rebirth, John Locke, Robert Boyle, Christopher Wren, carried its lessons into their work. The idea that institutions could be rationally redesigned to prevent catastrophe became foundational to modern governance. The Royal Society's motto nullius in verba, take nobody's word for it, might as well have been London's post-fire creed, a city that had learned the hard way to question assumptions about safety. Yet for all these tangible influences, the fire's greatest gift was perhaps its ambiguity. It remained Rorschach blot upon which every generation projected its fears and aspirations. To Victorian moralists, it was divine punishment for urban sin. To Edwardian engineers, a technical challenge overcome. To postmodern scholars, a metaphor for creative destruction under capitalism. The fire resisted singular interpretation. It was tragedy and rebirth, failure and opportunity, ending and beginning intertwined. In our own era of climate crises and pandemics, London's story resonates with fresh urgency. When Hurricane Katrina submerged New Orleans, when wildfires consumed Paradise, California, when Beirut's port explosion shattered a city, the same questions surfaced that London faced in 1666. What do we preserve? What do we change? Who gets to decide? The answers remain as contested now as they were then. Modern disaster psychology confirms what Londoners discovered empirically, that survivors often experience post-traumatic growth alongside their grief. The fire that destroyed Sybil Thames' workshop ultimately expanded her opportunities. The financial systems Robert Viner developed from necessity became engines of global commerce. Even the charred books Joshua Curtin mourned made space for revolutionary scientific ideas. Loss and innovation walked hand in hand through London's ashes. Today, walking the city of London's glass and steel canyons, few physical traces of the fire remain. The monument still stands, though surrounded by skyscrapers that dwarf it. Fragments of the Roman wall that marked the fire's western limit now peek unexpectedly from office basements. And if you know where to look, occasional plaques mark the sites where the flames finally died, not with heroic last stands, but through exhaustion and changed winds. Yet the fire's legacy lives on in unexpected ways. London's modern skyline, with its juxtaposition of Wren's spires and glass towers, embodies the same tension between memory and progress that defined the reconstruction. The city's labyrinthine street plan, still following medieval routes despite the fire's clean slate, speaks to the stubborn persistence of urban identity. Even the Thames Barrier, protecting modern London from flood, owes conceptual debts to 17th-century fire breaks. Perhaps most remarkably, the fire's demographic impact persists at genetic level. Studies of London's population genetics reveal a bottleneck effect in 1666, followed by an influx of new DNA as craftsmen flocked to the rebuilding. The city that emerged was literally remade at cellular level, its people as transformed as its architecture. In museums, The fire occupies curious middle ground, too distant for living memory, too close for myth. The Museum of London's exhibits walk this line carefully. A melted iron key here, a survivor's account there, all presented with scholarly detachment. Only in the rare surviving pre-fire buildings, the Tower, the Guildhall crypt, does the scale of loss become palpable. These spaces feel like negative images, their emptiness speaking louder than any relic could. The fire's ultimate lesson may be its simplest. Cities are not stone and mortar, but living networks of human relationships. London survived because its people chose to rebuild together. Bankers and bakers, kings and cobblers finding common purpose in the ashes. Their greatest monument isn't St. Paul's or the monument, but the very idea that catastrophe can be transformed into renewal. As climate change threatens cities worldwide with floods and fires, as pandemics expose urban vulnerabilities, London's example offers both warning and hope. The flames of 1666 created the blueprint for modern urban resilience, not through perfect solutions, but through messy, determined adaptation. The city didn't so much conquer its trauma as learn to coexist with it, carrying the fire forward not as scar, but as compass. Standing by the Thames at night, watching laser lights play across the Shard's glass facade, one can almost see ghostly reflections of that other illumination from 350 years prior. The glow is different now, cooler, more controlled, but the city's essence remains, a place forever burning and rebirthing, its phoenix wings reflecting both flame and starlight. London endures not despite the fire, but because of it. And in that paradox lies hope for every city that must one day face its own inferno.